Jeff, thank you for joining us. It's sort of a milestone occasion, if you like, for so good. It's a milestone occasion for Perseus, and particularly for yourself, because for those who haven't realised, Jeff has announced his retirement from his long-standing position. I should really give a little short biography, if you don't mind, Jeff. Jeff has been with Perseus since 2010, first as CFO and Managing Director and Chief Executive Officer since 2013. He has got a number of professional qualifications, including a CPA, an MBA, and a degree in civil engineering, I'm right to say. There's only the geologists in the office who get away with pulling the wool over your eyes, I'm assuming. And he has more than 30 years' experience in the ASX-listed space, particularly in the resources sector, with companies spanning the globe, really, from the Asia-Pacific region, PNG in particular, to South America, and, of course, latterly in West Africa. So this is really an opportunity to sort of chart the progress of Perseus over your period in the hot seat, and come up with some of your thoughts on the sector. We've had a lot of interesting debate in the last day and a half, some heated debate as well, as we've seen this morning. And so we wanted to take this opportunity to hear from you and your thoughts on the sector. I mean, looking back at your time at Perseus, it's a very different company today to what it was in 2010. You were a single asset company at the time, really striving to develop in much the same way Matt Wilcox and Robex are, your foundational asset at Edikan in Ghana. And struggling for market attention, really. Fast forward 12 or 13 years, 15 years, and it's a very different company. You've got 3 operating assets across Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, a development asset, we just heard from the Commissioner of Minerals in Nyanzaga in Tanzania, and then nearly 8 million ounces of gold in reserve, more than 5 in resource, more than 5 million in reserve, and a market cap of $5.5 billion. The question that leaps out to me, Jeff, in the first instance is, what's the secret? What's in the DNA of Perseus that's allowed you to elevate yourselves into this position?
Well, look, it's been an interesting journey, hasn't it? And it's occurred over a pretty long time, I must say. But and a lot of people have been involved in delivering those outcomes. I mean, the subject of DNA is an interesting one as to what really drives the business. But I think in our case, along the journey there, we established what our core values were, and we worked this with a lot of our people, and we all agreed that this is a way to take things forward. And I think with that as a basis, that defines the DNA of the company. The values are really quite simple: teamwork, integrity, commitment and achievement. But in a nutshell, I guess the thing is that Perseus is characterised best, I think, by the expression that we use frequently, and that is that we do what we say we're going to do. And I think that is something that our track record demonstrates quite clearly that has been achieved. And I think the Minister, the High Commissioner from Tanzania, has had that experience very recently. I was fortunate enough to meet him about a year and a bit ago when we first went to Tanzania, and we laid out what it was that we could do. And I think he would agree with me that we have done everything that we have said we would do, and we're now moving to the next part of the journey. So having that commitment to deliver on promises is very fundamental to Perseus.
It strikes me that must be a real challenge when you've got competing expectations of different stakeholders, and there must be a temptation to promise things that that will give you short-term gain that maybe not necessarily you're going to be able, you may hope to achieve, but don't know that you've got any chance of achieving.
Well, I think I've been around the block enough times to know that that's a fairly short-term kind of strategy. No, that isn't a winning strategy at all. I mean, a fundamental premise on which we operate is that there has to be a fair and equitable allocation of benefits. Everybody has to get something out of the exercise. And, so quite often defining quite what is fair and equitable is a challenge, because everybody has their own views as to what that is. But as I've had the conversation many times and put it into fairly simplistic terms. If you've got a cake on the table, you can only eat it once. And if I give you a piece and you decide you want a bigger piece, well, who are you going to take it off? And that's where it boils down. And that's the basis of the conversations that we have with our host governments, our host communities, our employees, suppliers of goods and services, and shareholders. Yes, by all means, you can increase the government take, but somebody has to pay the bill. And who would you suggest that is?
You've talked about Tanzania there, and the Commissioner talked about spending time negotiating the mining agreement over Nyanzaga and the terms and conditions. And I know you've spoken previously about to Peter about how important it was to set those groundwork and understanding of where each other was coming from, to agree on what you agreed on before you moved forward with negotiations. Can you talk through that process a little bit for us?
No, there was a very interesting exercise, and I must say, full credit to Leanne de Bruin, who's not here today, but she led our efforts in Tanzania and did an outstanding job, and full marks to her. Look, the situation was this, that the company that owned the project prior to us had negotiated a framework agreement. But on either side of that being signed, there were material changes to the legislation. So 2020 and 2022, and the deal was signed in 2021. So when we came along and looked at those things, it was fairly clear to us that there was some ambiguity as to what actually the clauses meant. And from our perspective, we were of the view, we're going to be your partner for the next 20 years. I dare say somewhere along the next 20 years we'll have a difference of opinion, but wouldn't it be a good idea if we start off agreeing on what it all means? And that was the basic philosophy. So we sat down for over a year and went through various bits and pieces and worked very hard to understand what the motivation of various clauses were. So once we understood what it was that the government was trying to achieve, when they understood what we were trying to achieve, we were able to find common ground. Now, just to think that either side got everything they wanted is absolutely not correct. Both of us had to concede on various points, but the thing was, I think both parties walked from the table feeling that they'd had a win, and that was a very important basis for the future.
Have those styles of negotiation, have they changed down the years from when you were putting frameworks together in Cote d'Ivoire, or when you were negotiating with the government in Ghana over them early years, or is it a matter of each individual country having individual circumstances that drive those discussions?
Look, it is a very individualistic thing, but not only that, time changes perceptions as well. Actually, the very first agreement that I was involved in negotiating wasn't in Africa at all. It was in Papua New Guinea, and it was the special mining lease for Lihir Gold. And I can assure you that that was an exercise in itself. In fact, I think it took longer than the gestation period of both of my children combined to get to an answer at the end of it, but we finally got there. But the thing is that the situation is very dynamic, and I think anybody who's familiar with Africa would say that Africa today is a very dynamic situation. Things are changing quite quickly right across the continent, but there does seem to be some general themes that are pushing this through, and the themes are the desire to have a fair and equitable proportion of the benefits that come from mining. The imperatives are that there's a growing youthful population that needs to be serviced, and so the host countries very definitely need to be able to satisfy that urge. So we understand that, but at the same time, we understand that our investors are giving us capital to invest, and they expect a return as well. So it's about getting that balance right.
And it's fair to say that, and certainly not in Africa, but across the world, state-owned mining has not exactly had a brilliant track record of development and growth down the years. What is it about Perseus that you bring, a commercial company, a listed market-based company like Perseus brings to a jurisdiction and a project like Nyanzaga or Edikan or Yaouré or Sisingwe for that matter, that a sort of a state-owned company couldn't?
Oh, well, I'm not too sure, what a state-owned company would do, because I've never been part of one. But I think, the most valuable thing that we know is that we don't know. And so when we approach these situations, we don't go in there with a preconceived notion of what good is. We go in there with an idea of where we'd like to be, but we also are willing to talk and understand other people's perspectives. So knowing that you don't know is pretty darn valuable, let me tell you.
And you were talking about that the shifting dynamics. Is that something that throughout the company, and that's going back to that DNA throughout the company, that you try to understand and understand the nuances in each jurisdiction that you work in, not just at a national level but a community level as well, and adapt and adjust while retaining your values in that space?
Oh, well, look, I mean, most certainly. But let me tell you, our employees in Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, I mean, they have very, very strongly embraced the culture that we have sought to develop. And it's incredibly gratifying to me to go to the sites and have things thrown back to me. Look, we do what we say we're going to do, or, we've got to work as a team. And, it then manifests itself really well in, I think, we took our board to the sites recently, and afterwards a number of the directors came up and said they were really stunned by the number of people that came up to them and said, I love working for this company, I've never had a better job. And to me that says that we're kind of doing something right, to be able to get our local people really embracing the concepts that we are seeking to do.
Is it a one-size-fits-all situation in there? Did you take what you'd done in Ghana and move it to Cote d'Ivoire, and then now moving that to Tanzania? Or explain that sort of process.
No, look, we've been on a learning curve, crikey. I mean, if you consider what we know today versus what we knew when we started in Ghana, I can tell you we know a bit more about it today. In fact, I jokingly say that when we moved to build the Sissingi mine in Cote d'Ivoire, we took 12 volumes of what not to do. And each time we've built another mine, we've added another volume or two to that pile. So the pile's getting pretty big, let me assure you. But each place is different and has different dynamics, and so we've been able to sort of learn a few things on the way.
Just going back to Tanzania, because as a commissioner mentioned, it's been through a lot of flux over the last decade, and then Nyanzaga is actually I believe the first new mine to be licensed in nearly 2 decades, really. In that period, around 2017, there was major changes to the mining legislation and the mining framework. What did you need to see when you made your investment or considered your investment in the project? What were you looking for in the National Mining Code and in the policies of government to give you assurance that there was a base to start from? Well,
our consideration started well before that. I mean, frankly, we look at the geology and the mineral, potential, and if it's not there, then that's the end of the story. And then you go from there. And then it's a question of saying, well, okay, can we make this work? Can we make a satisfactory return? Can we actually operate under these circumstances? And they're all things that you check your way through.
And are you confident that that spread of different jurisdictions is one that Perseus is going to benefit from?
Look, I think that is front and centre and fundamental to the success that our company has had, because, it's never been a good idea to put all your apples in one basket, so to speak. And, the idea of diversification is not new to us, by golly. I mean, all of the fund managers do it, etc., etc. We recognised very early in the piece, being in Ghana, that for us to survive the volatility of politics across the continent, we needed to have a number of different mines, and we needed to have a spread of political risk. And so that was what drove the strategy. And I have to say that it's been well founded, because if you look at our production performance on a day in, day out basis, it's very rare that all 3 mines have a fantastic day. One of them does really well, one of them has a shocker, and the other's okay, which means we still hit our budgets and we consistently deliver on our performance. Now, the same thing can be said about countries across the continent as well, because as a lot of people in the room know, that many of the countries are on a 5-year political cycle. And, a lot of constitutions permit presidents to only run a couple of times. So it almost guarantees that every 5 years or 10 years or something like that, there is going to be a material shift in attitudes. Now, sometimes it happens a little bit earlier. The populations don't wait for the 5 years, and they bring about change sooner. But that is part and parcel of the universe in which we operate, and recognising that and being able to accommodate that is pretty important.
We accommodate, that's an interesting word to use, because we often hear companies lamenting the fact that there's political change or shifts in sentiment in countries, and taking a quite aggressive stance at times. Now, you've been very forthright in your opinions at times in negotiations or relations with governments, but you've always been able to find a solution, or at least sit down and work your way through situations.
Well, look, one of the things, and I understand there's been a bit of conversation around this topic at this conference, but one of the really fundamentally important things for an investor is to have stability for a period of time for you to at least recover your investment. Okay, so in some instances, we'll have a stability agreement, and it will guarantee a period of time where the fiscal regime won't change. Now, if you do what you say you're going to do, you'll get your money back by that time, and then from that you can move on. I mean, that is probably the biggest bugbear, I would think, for investors who are making large investments into these scenarios. Now, we don't actually have a stability agreement everywhere we are. We do in Côte d'Ivoire, and we now do in Tanzania, but we haven't had one at all in Ghana. But yet we've still been able to ride the highs and lows of that for, what is it now? Goodness me, nearly 15 years or something. So, it'd be nice to have, but sometimes you don't get what you want, right? So,
talking about that 15 years, and the point you mentioned earlier that you said the individual assets may not perform on a day-to-day basis. I think back to our early interviews together when it was a matter of what Edikan was doing on a day-to-day basis. And one, are you still looking at the production numbers for each asset on a day-to-day basis? And two, then after, take us back to that period. How did you chart? It was a really tough period for the company. How did the company chart a path through what could have been terminal for its future?
Well, to answer your question, yes, I do. They arrive in my inbox at about 3 o'clock every morning, so I know that pretty well. But,
Adrian, did you know that? He's checking still.
Yeah, he knows. No, look, it was an interesting journey, and as I said, look, if you look at Perseus's history, I call the company the accidental miner, and I don't think I'm insulting anybody who started Perseus off, but I don't really think they ever had any intention at all of becoming a mining company. They were a junior exploration company that got lucky and found something. And, it was an interesting time because they had this property, and the stock price was running, almost vertically at that particular time. And it's like, well, surely someone's going to take us over. And no one came along. So I was like, oh, Christ, we're going to have to do a feasibility study. And then I was like, oh, God, we're going to have to build this thing. So we started from a basis where we were extremely ill-prepared to do what happened. And in that respect, I guess we were pretty lucky to survive the journey. But, I'm immensely proud of Edikan, I've got to say, because for probably the first, 5 or 6 years of that mine life, everybody said it's a dog. It's an absolute dog, But the interesting thing was whenever we took people to the site, they always left with a very different opinion. They were amazed at the scale, they were amazed at the efficiency, they were amazed at the commitment of the people to turning this into a fantastic operation. And now today, and over the last couple of years, we've been producing around 180,000 ounces of gold a year, and we've been doing it at about $1,000 an ounce, which makes that mine one of the leading gold mines in the world. So what was a dog is no longer a dog. It's actually a very, very valuable asset, and we're enormously proud of that journey.
And how's that come about? Is that through the investment in the asset, investment in the exploration, in the understanding of the ore bodies?
I think all of those things, but it's also come about because of massive commitment and professionalism of our Ghanaian team. And I'm, really proud to say 100% of our employees and management at Edikan are Ghanaians. The guys have done an absolutely fantastic job, been totally committed to the cause. And, one of the things that does drive them is that they know that, as long as they continue to perform extremely well, the mine continues, which means that the community benefits, their families benefit, the government benefits, and of course our shareholders benefit. So they're very much committed to that goal of continuing that operation for as long as they can.
When in Bill Repard's opening remarks yesterday, he mentioned the idea, the concept of this conference was at a time when Australian companies couldn't raise capital for African projects and had to go elsewhere. In fact, Perseus itself ended up listing on the TSX to try and access other pools of capital. Do you think those attitudes have changed? Do you think Perseus has played a role in changing the attitudes of Australian or ASX investors, at least, as to the potential?
I'm not too sure about that, but we carry a very, very heavy discount in our share price relative to an Australian company. Nothing could demonstrate that more clearly than last week when we released our results, and we are one of the most profitable gold mining companies on the ASX, yet our share price doesn't reflect that. But no, look, actually the whole business of financing and coming to public markets for money, et cetera, is a very interesting question. And I know that when companies are very small, they don't have an awful lot of choices. But when you are competing, as we are, for assets with people from different backgrounds, with different costs of capital, we are at a serious disadvantage. And I'm talking about our friends from China. They have financing capacity that we simply cannot compete with. They can pay prices that are way beyond what we can do if we're investing to generate a return on funds employed. So somehow along the way, we're going to have to figure out how can we be smarter about how we fund our projects and if we're going to be able to compete on a global stage.
And does that apply specifically to gold or more widely, or probably specifically to some other geopolitically or critical minerals?
Well, I really can't say because I don't know. This is a short answer, but I can only really talk about gold because that's what I've been working in for the last squillion years, it seems like. But yeah.
So you've been working in it for a squillion, or at least 30 I've got in my notes, and 30 years ago the gold price was not, it's fair to say, $3,500 US a price. Is that fundamentally in what's happened in the last 2 years in particular, but over a period of time, has that fundamentally changed the way that Perseus does business? Has it opened up new opportunities? Has it led to more different approaches to the business?
No, I'm not. Well, not really, because frankly, I can't believe the gold price. It's astronomical, isn't it? But no, look, very early in my career, I can remember the gold price was about $200 an ounce, and everyone was saying, "Oh, it's going to 150 or something like that." And that working in that environment taught me that if you wanted to make ends meet, you had to be extremely disciplined about how you went about things, fiscally and every other way. And that's been something that has never left me, that experience. So, we run our business, pretty tight ship. We're very, very responsible about how we use other people's money. In fact, I used to work for a company and, I'd take forward investment propositions and the CEO would say to me, "Well, would you invest in it if it was your money?" And that was the sort of a core question. And I'd have to think about that sometimes, but, and I'd say, "Yeah, I would actually." And we still sort of think about that even today where there's an opportunity to do something, but, really, would you be doing it if it was your money rather than throwing around someone else's? And I think that sense of discipline, while it's a bit boring for some folk, it does stand you in good stead when times are not so good.
As we mentioned, Judge, to step down from your position in just a few weeks' time, what would you like your legacy to be? In a company like Perseus, there's a few angles that you could come from. So let's start corporately. What do you think you will leave at Perseus as a corporate entity?
Oh, look, it's a company in extremely good shape. We're financially on a completely different planet to what we were 10 years ago. But, the thing that we have done extremely well, I think, and if I can say so over that time, is build up a wonderful team of people. We go out specifically to employ the very best people we can find and with no prejudice of any kind, and we bring them in. And I think that's been super important to the success we've had, because not only are those people immensely talented when they come in the door, but they've bought into the concept that you work pretty hard when you're at Perseus and you deliver the outcome. So, having established a fabulous team, the challenge now is to maintain that enthusiasm and look for the next phase of growth. And I've got every confidence that, the team will deliver that. And in fact, we've been pretty conscious over time of being able to set it up in that way such that if anybody moved out of the line, it would be seamless. And I'm pretty sure that that's what's going to happen.
Yeah, it does feel like the incumbent, Craig Jones, is the football coach who's been handed a championship-winning team. It happens so rarely. What an opportunity. What about the legacy from host community and host country perspective? What makes you proud about what you've done?
Oh, well, look, once again, it's not me, mate. I mean, it's the entire group. What makes me proud about the entire group? Well, it came out very strongly, actually. We were going around the sites a couple of weeks ago, and I hadn't really reflected on it too much until that time. But then people came out of the woodwork to talk about the contribution that Perseus has made to the communities around our mines. And I can tell you that the impact is enormous, and it goes from one end to the other. I mean, not only are we talking about in key infrastructure like schools and hospitals and things like that, but we've had a fairly profound impact on education. So giving people an opportunity, teaching them vocational skills, going down to health, and one of the things that people don't talk about very much, but it is an important issue. Like in many African countries, women fall out of the education system very early for one reason or another. And, in some instances, it's because they have children very young and they're not allowed back in, or it's because of health issues or whatever the case is. Some of the things that we have done in that area, which are as simple as anything, I believe will have the impact of encouraging women to stay in the education system and therefore the workforce. And I think that in itself is something that is quite transformational. Simple but important.
Thanks, Jeff. Well, I've just got one final question, and then we're going to wrap up a little bit early because we've got lots of other interesting speakers to come ahead. But when you reflect in 12 months' time, we don't know what your future is, of course, but we reflect in 12 or 24 months' time, what will you miss when you wake up on the 4th of September 2026 and you wake up and you think, what I miss about being the leader of an African mining company? What will it be?
I've got absolutely no idea. I haven't thought that far ahead. But no, I do think the thing that I will miss most is the people. I'm unbelievably privileged to have worked with some fantastic people and met a lot of interesting people. And I sort of say to my wife, on a given day, I probably talk to people all around the world, and quite a lot of them. So I've been able to meet a lot of really, really fantastic people and get an international perspective on a lot of issues. I think, one of the things in Australia, people are pretty myopic, as it were, and don't have a broader perspective. But through our activities, I've been blessed to have that opportunity to see things from a different perspective, and that helps, to understand what's going on out there.
Well, thanks very much, Jeff. I really appreciate your time this afternoon. If everybody could join us and thank Jeff. And I'll pass back over to Nakando. I'll just remind, standing ovation. That wasn't fun. Thanks, mate.